July 13, 1940. Lieutenant Toshihiro Ura opened his leather-bound diary for the last time in a makeshift bunker on Mund Point, New Georgia. His hands trembled as he wrote by candlelight, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had witnessed over the previous 72 hours. The words he recorded that night would remain hidden in American intelligence archives for decades, revealing a truth about the Pacific War that neither side wanted to acknowledge. What he saw in those final days would challenge everything both Japanese propaganda and Allied narratives claimed about the nature of combat in the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Ura commanded a reinforced infantry platoon defending the western approaches to Munda Airfield. His unit had arrived 3 weeks earlier as part of the Japanese 8th Fleet's desperate attempt to hold the Solomon Islands chain. The diary he kept violated standing orders. Personal records were forbidden to prevent intelligence leaks if captured. Yet Ura wrote meticulously every night, documenting not battle statistics, but the human reality unfolding around him. On July 10th, American forces began their final push toward the airfield. Ura's position faced elements of the 43rd Infantry Division, advancing through dense jungle terrain. His diary entries from those days recorded something unexpected. The American soldiers he observed through field glasses didn't match the propaganda descriptions his men had been fed for months. They weren't the reckless, individualistic warriors Japanese command had described. They moved with coordinated precision, supported by devastating artillery that arrived with mechanical regularity. More disturbing to Ura was what he witnessed among his own men. The diary recorded their deteriorating condition with clinical detail. Malaria had infected over 60% of his platoon. Supplies promised by a naval convoy had never arrived. The rice rations had been cut to 1/3 normal portions. His men were starving in a jungle that should have provided sustenance because they lacked the energy to forage and the knowledge to identify edible plants. On July 12th, Ura received orders to hold his position for another 48 hours to allow evacuation of headquarters staff. That night, he wrote an entry describing the faces of his men when he relayed the order. They knew what it meant. No relief was coming. No evacuation would include them. They were being sacrificed to buy time for officers to escape. His final entry on July 13th contained a single paragraph that American translators would flag as significant when the diary was recovered 3 weeks later. The battle for Mund Point represented a critical phase in the Allied campaign to neutralize Japanese air power in the Solomon Islands. The airfield at Munda had been operational since December 1942, giving Japanese bombers and fighters a forward base to threaten Allied shipping lanes and support positions throughout the region. Control of Munda would shift the balance of air superiority in the Central Solomons. The new Georgia campaign began on June 30th, 1943, when American forces landed on Renova Island to establish artillery positions within range of Manda. The Japanese garrison defending the airfield numbered approximately 10,000 troops, but they faced crippling disadvantages. Naval supply lines had been severed by American air and submarine attacks. The jungle terrain that should have favored defenders instead became a trap, as disease and malnutrition devastated units faster than combat. Lieutenant Ura's unit represented the typical composition of Japanese forces in the Solomons by mid-1943. His men were a mix of regular infantry and hastily trained replacements. Many had been transferred from garrison duty in Manchuria and had no experience with jungle warfare or tropical diseases. The Japanese command structure assumed that fighting spirit and tactical aggression would compensate for material shortages. Ura's diary would document the fatal consequences of this assumption. The American forces advancing on Munda employed a methodical approach that contrasted sharply with Japanese tactics. Rather than rushing forward, they established secure supply lines, built field hospitals, and coordinated massive artillery bombardments before each advance. This systematic approach frustrated Japanese commanders, who expected rapid assaults they could counter with surprise attacks and close combat. Ura observed this pattern and recognized its significance. Ura's diary entries from late June through mid-July 1943 provided American intelligence officers with an unprecedented window into Japanese defensive operations and morale. The document was recovered on August 3rd when Marine Patrol secured the Western Bunker Complex, where URA's unit had made its final stand. The diary was found in a waterproof pouch alongside URA's personal effects and military documents. The translation process revealed details that challenged American assumptions about Japanese military effectiveness. Intelligence analysts had believed Japanese units maintained cohesion and fighting capability until physically destroyed. Ura's diary showed a different reality. His unit had begun disintegrating weeks before the final American assault, not from combat losses, but from systemic failures in logistics and medical support. The entries from early July described the daily routine of a unit in terminal decline. Morning formations revealed men too weak to stand. Medical supplies consisted of bandages and iodine, no quinine for malaria, no antibiotics for infected wounds, no plasma for shock treatment. Ura recorded that his unit's medical corpsman had committed suicide on July 8th after watching 3 men die from treatable dysentery. The corpsman left a note saying he could no longer bear the helplessness of watching men die from lack of basic medicines. Food supplies had become critical by the second week of July. The diary documented the breakdown of the naval supply system that was supposed to sustain Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomons. Ura's unit had been promised regular deliveries by fast destroyer runs, the Tokyo Express convoys that had successfully supplied Guadalcanal. But American air superiority had made these runs impossible. The last supply delivery his unit received arrived on June 24th, nearly 3 weeks before the final battle. The diary revealed how quickly malnutrition degraded combat effectiveness. By July 10th, Ura estimated that fewer than 30 of his original 85 men could perform combat duties. The rest were incapacitated by disease, malnutrition, or wounds that wouldn't heal due to weakened immune systems. He described men who could barely lift their rifles, who fell asleep during guard duty, not from negligence, but from exhaustion, who hallucinated from fever and starvation. What made Ura's observations particularly valuable to American intelligence was his analytical approach. Unlike most captured documents that focused on tactical details or propaganda rhetoric, Ura's diary attempted to understand why his unit was failing. He had been educated at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and had studied military history and logistics. His entries compared Japanese and American operational methods with striking clarity. On July 11th, Ura wrote an extended analysis of American artillery tactics. He had observed that American guns fired, according to precise schedules, coordinated with infantry movements. The bombardments weren't random harassment, but carefully planned strikes designed to suppress specific defensive positions before assaults. He noted that American forward observers communicated constantly with artillery batteries, adjusting fire in real time based on observed effects. Japanese artillery, when available, fired predetermined barges with no adjustment mechanism. The diary described the psychological impact of this systematic American approach. Ura's men had been trained to expect aggressive enemy attacks they could meet with counterattacks and close combat. Instead, they faced an enemy that advanced slowly, methodically behind walls of artillery fire and airstrikes. There was no opportunity for the decisive close-quarters battle that Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized. The Americans simply ground forward, destroying defensive positions with overwhelming firepower before infantry ever made contact. Ura recorded conversations with other officers defending nearby sectors. They shared his growing realization that Japanese tactical doctrine had become obsolete. The emphasis on fighting spirit and aggressive tactics assumed rough parity in firepower and logistics against an enemy with massive material superiority and systematic operational methods. Traditional Japanese tactics were suicidal. Yet command continued issuing orders based on outdated assumptions about how battles would unfold. The diary's most significant entries came in the final days before Ura's death. On July 12th, he wrote about receiving the order to hold his position for 48 hours. He understood immediately that this was a death sentence. Headquarters was evacuating by barge to Kolombangara Island, abandoning forward units to delay the American advance. Ura didn't criticize the decision in his diary. He simply recorded it as confirmation of what he had already concluded about the campaign's outcome. That same entry contained Ura's analysis of why the order to hold was militarily pointless. His unit lacked the strength to delay a determined American assault for more than a few hours. The men were too weak, too sick, too demoralized to mount effective resistance. A tactical withdrawal to consolidate forces would have preserved combat power for future operations. Instead, his unit would be sacrificed for minimal strategic gain simply because doctrine demanded that positions be held until destroyed. Ura spent July 13th preparing his men for the final battle. The diary described his attempts to maintain morale among soldiers who understood they had been abandoned. He organized the remaining food into a final meal. He distributed ammunition, though many men lacked the strength to carry full combat loads. He wrote letters for men who wanted final messages sent to families, knowing these letters would likely never be delivered. His final diary entry written that evening contained no heroic rhetoric or patriotic declarations. Instead, Ura wrote a clinical assessment of what he had learned. He wrote that the Japanese Empire was not losing the war because its soldiers lacked courage. Every man in his unit had proven willing to die for their country. They were losing because the enemy had built systems that made individual courage irrelevant. The Americans had systems for feeding troops in the jungle, for treating malaria, for delivering ammunition, for coordinating artillery and air support, for evacuating wounded, for replacing losses. Japan had slogans about fighting spirit. Ura concluded his diary with a prediction. He wrote that unless Japan could match American logistical and organizational capabilities, the war would end in complete defeat, regardless of how bravely individual soldiers fought. Tactical victories might be possible, but strategic success required the systematic approach that only the Americans had mastered. His final sentence stated that he hoped someone would read these words and understand that courage alone could never defeat an enemy with superior systems. American forces overran Ura's position on July 14th. The assault lasted less than 2 hours. Most of the Japanese defenders were too weak to resist effectively. Ura was killed by artillery fire before American infantry reached his bunker. The diary was discovered 3 weeks later during cleanup operations and forwarded to intelligence analysts in Guadalcanal. The translation of Ura's diary created significant discussion among American intelligence officers. Some dismissed it as defeat propaganda or unreliable personal opinion. Others recognized it as an accurate assessment of Japanese logistical failures. The diary was classified and filed in intelligence archives, where it remained largely forgotten for decades. Modern historians who have studied Ura's diary consider it one of the most insightful Japanese documents from the Pacific War. It provides rare evidence of how mid-level Japanese officers perceived the growing disparity between Japanese and American military capabilities. Ura's analysis of systematic versus individualistic approaches to warfare has been cited in numerous studies of Pacific theater operations. The fall of Manda Airfield on August 5, 1943, confirmed Ura's predictions. Japanese forces evacuated to Kolombangara and eventually withdrew from the Central Solomons entirely. The campaign demonstrated that Japanese defensive tactics could not overcome American material and organizational superiority. Every subsequent battle in the Pacific followed the pattern Ura had identified. Systematic American advances grinding down Japanese positions that lacked adequate supply and support. The diary also revealed the human cost of Japan's strategic failures. Ura's unit suffered an 80% casualty rate, but fewer than 20% of those casualties resulted from direct combat. The majority died from disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. This pattern repeated across Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific. Soldiers died not from enemy action, but from their own military's inability to sustain forces in the field. Ura's observations about American artillery tactics proved particularly prescient. The systematic coordination between forward observers, artillery batteries, and infantry units became the hallmark of American operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. This integration of firepower and maneuver allowed American forces to advance with relatively low casualties while inflicting devastating losses on defenders. The diary's analysis of morale and combat effectiveness challenged both Japanese and American wartime narratives. Japanese propaganda claimed that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantages. American propaganda portrayed Japanese soldiers as fanatical warriors who fought to the death. Ura's diary showed a more complex reality. Japanese soldiers were willing to fight, but were being destroyed by systemic failures beyond their control. Intelligence analysts who studied the diary after the war noted that Ura had identified the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. Japan's military culture emphasized individual heroism and tactical aggression. America's military culture emphasized systematic planning and logistical superiority. In prolonged warfare, systems defeated heroism every time. The diary also documented the breakdown of Japanese naval supply operations. Ura's unit was supposed to receive regular deliveries via the Tokyo Express destroyer runs. By July 1943, American air power had made these missions suicidal. Japanese commanders continued planning operations that assumed functioning supply lines, even as those supply lines collapsed. Ura recognized this disconnect between planning and reality. Modern military analysts have used Ura's diary as a case study in the importance of logistics and systems thinking. His observations about the relationship between supply, morale, and combat effectiveness are taught at military meets as examples of how wars are actually won and lost. The diary demonstrates that tactical skill and individual courage matter far less than organizational capability and systematic support. The fate of Ura's men after his death illustrated his final predictions. The survivors of the July 14th assault were too weak to retreat effectively. Most were captured or died attempting to reach Japanese lines on Kolombangara. American medical personnel who treated captured Japanese soldiers were shocked by their physical condition. Many required weeks of treatment for malnutrition and disease before they could even be interrogated. Lieutenant Ura's diary stands as one of the most honest assessments of Japanese military failures in the Pacific War, written by a serving officer. His analysis proved tragically accurate. Japan's emphasis on fighting spirit and tactical aggression could not overcome systematic American superiority in logistics, coordination, and material support. Every major battle from Munda forward followed the pattern he identified. The diary's significance extends beyond its immediate historical context. Ura identified a fundamental truth about modern warfare that remains relevant today. Wars are not won primarily by individual heroism or tactical brilliance. They are won by organizations that can sustain operations over time, that can coordinate complex systems, that can adapt and learn from experience. The side with better systems will defeat the side with better slogans. Ura's final words expressed hope that someone would read his observations and learn from them. His diary was indeed read by American intelligence officers who used his insights to refine their understanding of Japanese weaknesses. Decades later, historians and military analysts continue to study his words as a case study in how wars are actually decided. The men of Ura's unit died not because they lacked courage, but because their military system failed them. They starved in a jungle that could have fed them. They died of treatable diseases. They fought without adequate ammunition or support. Their sacrifice brought nothing of strategic value. Ura understood this and wrote it down, hoping his honesty might prevent future soldiers from dying the same way. The Pacific War would continue for 2 more years after Manda fell. The pattern UA identified would repeat on every island, in every jungle, on every beach where Japanese and American forces met. One side had systems, the other had slogans. The outcome was never in doubt once that disparity became clear. If this story revealed something about the Pacific War you hadn't considered before, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. What aspect of Lieutenant Ura's observations surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Next time, we'll explore another moment when individual soldiers confronted the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Thanks for watching, and remember, history is written by those who understand that courage alone is never. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.